The scripture this morning is from the first chapter of Mark, verses 21 through 34. Jesus and his followers went to Capernaum immediately on the Sabbath. Jesus entered the synagogue and started teaching. The people were amazed by his teaching, for he was teaching them with authority, not like the legal experts. Suddenly, there in the synagogue, a person with an evil spirit screamed, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One from God." "Silence," Jesus said, speaking harshly to the demon. "Come out of him." The unclean spirit shook him and screamed, then it came out. Everyone was shaken and questioned among themselves, "What's this? A teaching with authority? He even commands evil, unclean spirits, and they obey him." Right away, the news about him spread throughout the entire region of Galilee. After leaving the synagogue, Jesus, James, and John went to the home with Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed, sick with a fever, and they told Jesus about her at once. He went up to her, took her by the hand, raised her up. The fever left her, and she served them. That evening at sunset, people brought to Jesus those who were sick or demon-possessed. The whole town gathered near the door. He healed many who were sick with all kinds of diseases, and he threw out many demons. But he didn't let the demons speak because they recognized him.
Thank you, Sam. You may be seated. Now let's just make sure it's not... Sure. There we go. There was a point where I wanted to make sure I didn't override everybody else. You know, you need multiple voices in worship, don't you? So, it's an interesting passage, this story of miracles, the way Mark tells the miracles of Jesus, starting out with healing. And you know, you already know stuff, important things to help you understand this. For instance, have you ever had a fever? Yes? Have you ever had a fever that left you so sick you could not do one of your most favorite things at work? Don't tell me you haven't. Because we all have. My own personal remember of having a fever and being sick was I was a 7th grader, and my parents had finally given me permission to go to a school dance, and I had a fever. Turned out to be I had a form of rheumatic fever, and I spent 6 months on bed rest, and I missed the dance. Dang. That's what we're talking about here, is that fever that showed up unexpected, didn't know what it was, and it made Peter's mother-in-law miss work. So if you've had a fever and you've missed the part of your life's vocation that you really, truly enjoy, you already know a lot to understand this passage. You see, Peter's mother-in-law had a fever. Now, because Mark does not share her first name with us, it gives us permission to fill in the blank with the favorite mother-in-law we know. Now, this might not be your own mother-in-law. I'm just saying that. Because the mother-in-law I chose to name her after is actually my grandmother, Helen Hall Gentoft. And why did I pick Grandma Gentoft? Well, my dad used to say, my wife has mother-in-law problems, but I never did. And therefore, yes, somebody finally got it. Therefore, as now that I am a mother-in-law, I try copy Grandma. You all know somebody who's been a good mother-in-law. You don't even have to have been married. So, having dubbed her Helen, because Mark did not give us a name, against her will, Helen was forced to bed before Peter, Andrew, and Jesus came in the front door. Their home was probably, by our standards, a small house, perhaps large by theirs, but certainly archaeologists tell us less than about 1,000 square feet. So not very big for a multiple generation family. If there was a second floor or a sleeping loft, it most likely was not where her bed was, because privacy as they knew it and needed it was very different than privacy as we know it or need it. So as you imagine her being there, think of her on a kind of a rolled out bed on the floor, something that could be rolled up if she wasn't sick, there in the main room, perhaps even in the very room they arrived in when they came in off the street. Fever is the only symptom we know of Helen's disease. And my dear sister, the one who stayed in the family business of medicine, has told me more than once, the symptom is never the disease. Fever is our body's own defense mechanism fighting an infection. It isn't the fever that's the disease. The fever is a symptom to tell us there is a disease. The fever could be a symptom of the common cold. It could also be a symptom of cancer. It could be a fever is localized to a wound site. According to our experts at Wikipedia, that source of all world knowledge, fever is a presenting symptom for 75% of adults who are sick enough to seek medical help. Back when I was still serving in Beloit, I learned from a mortician friend that the tradition of burying a body as soon as one could after death, especially when the death was accompanied by a sudden fever, was an effective form of quarantine to protect the community from the disease. It's interesting to know, isn't it? It's still effective. They used it in the Ebola epidemic. But fever is not a disease. Fever is always a symptom. And therefore, walking in with Jesus, having seen the miracle at the temple, Peter and Andrew were astounded to see a woman they loved and respected there on something they presumed was her deathbed. It's a point we need to consider as we think about Christ healing us or healing those we love and pray for. Do we actually know what disease it is we need Christ to heal? Or where are we coming in on our assumptions? What we really know is only the symptoms, and symptoms are simply those things we can observe. To move it a little bit off from a fever, I was thinking about this in light of our being certified as a dementia-friendly church. Generally in our culture, at least if you're over 30, we all know that the loss of memory is a primary symptom of dementia. That's common knowledge. We all know it. We even make a worried joke about having dementia if we forget something or misplace something. Especially, I find keys. Keys seem to be a big source of dementia jokes. But before you go farther and assume it's dementia, you need to know that if that forgetfulness, if that loss of something, that symptom of loss, of poor memory, is not accompanied by a lack of self-awareness. You have to have both. It's probably not dementia. It's more likely that you were stressed out over work, or you were distracted by something, or heaven forbid, your spouse took your keys without your permission. Lost keys are just a symptom. The disease needs more to be diagnosed, and you might not know what the disease is underlying, because symptoms are never the disease. Still, symptoms can be treated, sometimes for cure and sometimes for comfort. Sending a fevered person to bed is actually a first stage of quarantine, and rest is good. And applying a cool cloth to a fever is an effective but ancient form of comfort care. It works for all fevers. And there are actually times that's still all that's needed. I know it's hard to think about this with our current sub-zero weather, but when you have hyperthermia in the summer because of the heat, put your wrists under cold water. It might be all that's needed. You might need more, but that symptom can be treated effectively, and you do no harm. So maybe as they came in, Helen, Peter's mother-in-law, remember that? I named her, had a damp cloth on her forehead before they arrived. And for those who are dementia aware, learning to just kind of have a hypothesis and to respond to these symptoms, not as something to be groused at, snarked at, why can't they? But to respond with grace rather than anger will always yield a better result, for which you can be grateful when the doctor tells you your loved one's memory problems are not Alzheimer's, but simply a need to change medications. So nice to have them back. The thing is, whether it's a cool cloth or just space to be forgetful, offering grace is imitating Jesus in what he offered Helen. He responded to her symptom with grace. He went into her. He didn't go running out of the house because she had a fever. Oh my goodness, I might catch something. No, he responded to her with grace. He went to her bed and took her by the hand, which healed her. And Mark leads us and wants us to know that this was a miraculous healing, even though we still don't know what the disease she had was. That Christ came to her, that he took her by the hand. And I would point out that for her to take, him to take her hand, she had to cooperate. Just saying. Helen went from being assumed to be on death's door back to being restored to good health and her place in the household. And this is a good news for anyone struggling with any sort of disease in their own life or in their loved ones. In Christ's presence, healing comes. It may be a return to full health, or it could be the ability to live and face this hard thing. But with Christ's presence, healing comes. But what is healing exactly that I'm saying that? There's our popular understanding that healing is being returned to full health, but a Christian biblical understanding of healing is being restored to our right place in the community of God's reign. Our popular understanding of healing never goes so far that it reverses aging or makes a body recover without having a scar. Even a broken bone leaves a scar that a later radiologist can see. But our Christian understanding of healing always means a return of personal dignity and the ability to be of service. Which leads us to the other word that is important in the story, and that's serve. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. It is so easy to read this and imagine Helen springing out of bed and acting like a diner waitress who's trying to make her way up, to bootstrap herself to a better life, showing all the hustle she can hustle. But that's not what's meant by service. Doing the Bible study for this sermon, I read a lot of commentaries, and I noticed that they were all written by men. And for once, that makes a difference. Because all these men pointed out that the verb used here for what Peter's mother-in-law did to serve is only used in the gospel for women and angels. It's not a verb applied to men. It is the verb form of diakonia, which is related to the form of ministry we United Methodists call an ordained deacon, as in Deacon Susan. Susan, I have not seen you out hustling tables at a frantic pace. No, you're good. So imagine Helen being like Susan, and you're pretty on. So a feminist translation of diakonia would be, Helen began to minister to them, or she began to take care of them. Her service was a form of leadership. Diakonia is what preachers and worship music leaders do every Sunday. Diakonia is what healthcare professionals do in response both to our symptoms and to our disease, even when it's hard news we don't want to hear. Diakonia is what restaurant owners and chefs do for the dining public. Diakonia is what mechanics who own their own business do every day for the motoring public. Diakonia is our leadership that makes everyday life better for the people who either work for us or who are benefiting by our skill set. Diakonia is what the best mother-in-law you have ever known, even if she isn't your mother-in-law, what the best mother-in-law you have ever known does for her family. By restoring Helen to her right place of leadership as a mature woman in her own home, Christ also restored her life's purpose as well. And this is good news. This is good news for Peter and Andrew. It is good news for the rest of their family, and it is good news for us as well. Turning to Christ leads to being completely healed, restored to our life's purpose in meeting others' needs. Service is not frantic, fearful obedience to an overlord. Service is taking our rightful place in the community for God's reign to be a reality in our time. When Christ took Helen's hand, she was healed and restored. All of us has a need somewhere in our life for Christ to take our hand and heal us. We all have symptoms of disease in our life. While fevers are symptoms of an infection, observable symptoms of hidden mental health issues could include perfectionism. It could include teasing. People who tease often aren't, there's a there. Or it could include over or under eating. It could include other addictive behaviors. It could include withdrawing, and I'm a little afraid to say this from a pulpit in church. It could even include super religiosity. There are indications we all need Christ to take us by the hand and restore us to diakonia. There are even behaviors that are positive in the normal, but can become symptoms in need for healing in the extreme. I was looking at grief, for instance, because there are a number of us here who are in a season of grief. I'm not targeting any one person. And it is reasonable when you lose someone you love deeply to have a season of grief, a season where you don't know what day it is, a season where it's hard to get out of bed and put one foot in front of the other. I was talking to my friend Dick, who does the therapy dogs, and when his loved one died, when Edgar passed away, he was so thankful that his dog forced him to get out of bed because the dog needed a walk. So grief happens. It is a part of life. But grief can also be dysfunctional or abnormal. A deacon friend of mine works with teenagers whose parents died while they were still teenagers. That's a person who needs a grief therapy group. Now, you don't get to be my age without having buried a few people, like grandparents. I've buried my mom, I've buried my father-in-law, I've buried one of my brothers, I've buried a good friend from high school, I lost count of people I've buried, friends, some suicides, some car accidents, some HIV, AIDS, because yes, I was born in the 50s and we didn't always have treatment. Long ago lost count. But I have a sense of how I behave in a season of grief. So it was hard for me when my daddy died, and that was an odd thing the last 6 weeks of his life. He wanted me to go back to calling him daddy because I was the only one of the kids who did. But when Daddy finally died, I had a harder than usual time putting one foot in front of the other, doing what needed to be done. And at 6 weeks, I decided to call our hospice in Dane County, since Dad's hospice was up in Duluth and I was south of Madison. And I called the folks at A Grace and said, "Do you have grief groups for people like me?" And I remember a very compassionate person, expert in grieving, who had answered the phone, and she said, "So what was your father's death day?" And I told her. And she said, "Take your calendar and mark it 6 months from that day. If you still can't cope, we have a group for you." You know, there was great peace of mind in knowing that I was normal. That was a Christ taking me by the hand moment. So I followed her directions and went back to doing those normal things that were so hard for me. Things I enjoyed about my work: praying and reading, pastoring and preaching, doing laundry. I actually like doing laundry, I'll just confess. Talking to my 3 children every weekend. I like being a mother-in-law. You know, I had good things in my life. And one day led on to another, and 4.5 months later, on a Monday, I turned the page on my calendar and it read A Grace. And I wrote no. I didn't need it. Being patient, turning to Christ in prayer, which is something my dad told me got me through through my mom's death, really had healed my grief. Now, that's not to say that the grief has completely gone away. There's a myth out there that you should get over it. That's baloney. But you should be able to be healed enough to stand up and return to your place in community and your service. There are times you will still grieve the person you lost. I mentioned that I lost my brother to brain cancer, and I'm here to tell you, on the day his daughter got married. Dang it, I'm doing it now. Okay. You understand. And it's okay, it's normal. It just makes me better at helping other people who are losing a sibling too soon. That's all it means. It's healed and it's restored. And that is what it is to be healed by Christ. It is to be restored to what you're able to do. And even to find yourself better equipped to carry out the service to which you are called. Now, I have no way of knowing what symptoms in your life need healing. Once in a while, I get a confessional insight, but that's rare. I don't even know if what I'm looking at when I look at you are your symptoms or if they are your disease. I don't know. But I do know this, and I do believe this. I need to imitate Christ, who will come to you as you are, take your hand, and heal you in the name of the Father, the same as he did for Peter's mother-in-law. Amen.